It is the middle of the night, and you are warm, half sunk into the folds of your pillow. Outside, the streetlight hums faintly, catching a few slow-moving flakes of dust or snow in its yellow glow. Nothing seems urgent, and yet, if there were such a thing as an invisible switch, hidden somewhere between the folds of your dreams, someone has just flipped it. You do not hear the click, but the world has changed. Every ancient language, every undeciphered script, every stubborn mark scratched into clay, painted on a cave wall carved into stone, suddenly it can be read. No scholars hunched over magnifying glasses, no decades of painstaking cross-comparison. Just a quiet shift, and the knowledge flows like water into every mind ready to receive it. For a moment, you don't know what's happened. But across the planet, museums, universities, and dusty storerooms breathe in sharply. Clay tablets in the British Museum practically hum with meaning. The carved stelae of forgotten kings in remote deserts, which for centuries have been nothing but enigmatic shapes, now recite their stories in voices so clear you almost imagine they are whispering in your ear. The idea feels both intoxicating and unsettling. We like to think we know the broad sweep of human history, the ancient empires, the famous battles, the rise of cities. But the truth is, most of what we know is a thin shell, an outline filled in with educated guesses. Behind that shell is an ocean of silence. Every undecoded script is a locked door, and behind each door could be anything. A dull list of grain shipments, a bawdy joke, a dire warning, a poem so beautiful it could make you cry. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here, and tell me in the comments where you are in the world right now, and what time it is where you are. I'm curious who's out there in the quiet hours, drifting somewhere between history and sleep. Imagine the scholars of the 19th century, men and women in dimly lit rooms, squinting at the Rosetta Stone. That slab of granodiorite discovered by accident in 1799 became the most famous multilingual puzzle in history. Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphs side by side like three separate voices telling the same story. Jean-François Champollion, after years of obsession, finally unlocked the door in 1822. It was like learning to hear ghosts speak. But in this midnight switch scenario, there's no Champollion, no decades of piecing together syllables. Every Rosetta Stone in the world, known or unknown, is suddenly decoded. There's something thrilling about it, but also something a little dangerous. When you can suddenly read everything, you don't get to choose what you learn first. Someone in a university basement might open a newly legible scroll to find that a beloved national origin story is pure invention. Someone else might read an account of a war that was supposed to have never happened, naming generals whose existence had been denied for centuries. The authoritative fact here is simple. More than 90% of the writing systems humanity has ever used remain unread. The Harappan script of the Indus Valley, Linear A from Minoan Crete, the Proto-Elamite script of ancient Iran, the Rongorongo boards of Easter Island, all still mute. Some may be unbreakable without a bilingual key, others might yield in time, but not in our lifetimes. Until, of course, the switch flips. But here's an odd fact for you, because history is never without its peculiar corners. In 1901, in the dusty Greek village of Pylos, archaeologists uncovered hundreds of clay tablets covered in a strange script. It took decades to decode what turned out to be records of sheep and olive oil rations. Imagine the world holding its breath for a great mystery, only to learn someone had just been doing their taxes. In our imagined instant decoding night, such anticlimaxes would happen again and again, and yet the possibility of wonders would be just as real. Hypothesis. Somewhere out there, in a forgotten ruin, or beneath a layer of volcanic ash, lies a text that could completely reorder our understanding of human origins. Historians are still debating whether the world's first true city was Uruk in Mesopotamia, or whether older, more complex urban centres have simply been erased by time. A fully translated archive from a yet undiscovered site could end that debate overnight, and open 10 new ones. You, lying there in the dark, might think it's all harmless curiosity. But information has always been power. In the past, rulers destroyed records to shape how they'd be remembered. Entire languages died because conquerors erased them. Now imagine those words, recovered, contradicting the official histories we've built. There would be a thrill in the academic halls, yes, but also fear in certain offices of power. In the stillness, you might picture it. An unrolled scroll in a dusty storeroom suddenly alive with meaning, the ink lines now more than just decorative curls, or a stone stele under a jungle canopy, its figures now telling a story so strange you have to read it twice to believe it. Across the world, historians would wake in the middle of the night, hearts pounding, suddenly aware that the silences they had studied their whole lives were now crowded with voices. And perhaps you would feel it too, the weight of knowing that the past is not a fixed thing, but a shifting tide, and that tonight the tide has turned in your direction. Picture the scene. It's still before dawn, but already the air is humming in archives, storerooms, and museum basements around the world. Somewhere in a locked glass case, a slab of basalt from the sands of Egypt suddenly becomes as clear as if it were written in your own language. The lines of hieroglyphs, so long a puzzle to the untrained eye, now unspool into words, sentences, paragraphs, whole stories. It is the Rosetta Stone all over again, but multiplied beyond counting. Not one stone, but hundreds, thousands. Rosetta Stones hidden in temples, shipwrecks, cliff faces, and personal collections suddenly doing what we always wished they would do: speak. The real Rosetta Stone was discovered by accident in 1799 by French soldiers near the town of Rashid during Napoleon's campaign in Egypt. It carried the same decree in 3 scripts: ancient Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphs. Because Greek was well understood, it became the key to unlocking the lost Egyptian writing system. Jean-François Champollion's breakthrough in 1822 didn't come overnight. It was the result of years of obsessive comparison, arguments with other scholars, and countless false starts. The hieroglyphs had been mute for over a millennium. Suddenly, they sang again. Now, in your midnight switch scenario, imagine that same joy, but without the decades of frustration. Scholars of Mayan glyphs no longer piecing together phonetic signs one by one. Instead, the codices that survived colonial destruction now lay themselves bare. The Voynich manuscript, that famously stubborn book filled with strange plants and looping script, tells its story without hesitation. And somewhere, perhaps in a cave, a tablet from a language no one has ever seen before greets its first human reader in thousands of years. The authoritative fact here: humanity's ability to decode ancient scripts depends heavily on finding a bilingual or trilingual key, like the Rosetta Stone or the Behistun inscription. Without such a key, decipherment often borders on guesswork. Scholars pore over repeating symbols, compare them to known languages, and make cautious hypotheses, but many scripts resist all attempts. But here's the odd fact for tonight. When the Rosetta Stone was first put on public display in London, it became so popular that visitors began chipping away tiny fragments to take home as souvenirs. The stone you see in the British Museum today is literally smaller than the one Napoleon's soldiers unearthed, because of hundreds of eager, careless hands. In our instant decoding world, one wonders, would we be disciplined enough to preserve these treasures, or would curiosity and greed undo them all over again? And here's the hypothesis. If all ancient scripts became readable, we might find that many cultures were not as isolated as history books imply. Historians are still debating whether maritime trade routes in the Bronze Age connected more of the Old World than we currently admit. If a bilingual inscription turned up in, say, Mesoamerica and the Mediterranean, it could suggest contact across oceans long before Columbus. It's strange to think that in the flicker of a moment, archaeology would shift from an age of speculation to an age of confirmation. Imagine the difference to our understanding of Egypt alone. Thousands of tombs have inscriptions we can read, yes, but many lesser-known sites contain obscure symbols or informal graffiti whose meanings are still unclear. What if a newly understood inscription casually described a pharaoh's military alliance with a kingdom we've never even heard of? What if a half-finished note carved by a bored stonecutter mentioned a completely different purpose for the pyramids, one that contradicts 2 centuries of scholarly consensus? And here is where the unsettling part creeps in. Not all history is flattering. Some civilizations built their myths on selective memory. A sudden avalanche of unfiltered original words from the past would topple certain cherished ideas. In the 19th century, for example, early translations of Egyptian texts challenged the Bible-based chronology of the world's age, sparking fierce backlash from both clergy and the public. If one translation could cause such uproar, what would millions of them do overnight? You might picture the world's newspapers the next morning, headlines clamouring over which ancient bombshell to cover first. Maybe the earliest mathematical treatise turns out to be centuries older than we thought, originating not in Greece but in an unexpected corner of Africa or Central Asia. Maybe the oldest surviving love poem is no longer Sumerian, but from a culture whose name we've barely whispered until now. Or perhaps the texts are not grand at all. Maybe they are petty, human, and funny. A royal scribe in 1500 BCE complaining about his bad lunch. A clay tablet that is just a teenager practicing the same sentence over and over. A court case over a stolen goat. These fragments of personality would be just as valuable, in their own way, as the epics and decrees. The air in your imagined museum is heavy with the sound of whispers becoming words. Across glass cases, curators lean closer to objects they've known for years but never truly met. And somewhere, in a small, dimly lit archive, a graduate student stares at a piece of pottery and realizes the faded marks are not decorative at all. They're a perfectly clear recipe for beer, unchanged for 3,000 years. It is both profound and delightfully trivial, the kind of detail that makes history breathe. And so the world stirs in this new dawn of comprehension, unsure whether it has been given a gift or a burden. You, still lying in your bed, are left to wonder, in a planet where the past can speak fluently again, will we actually listen, or will we only hear the parts that confirm the stories we already liked? The first cities of the world were not grand marble metropolises like we picture from the classical age. They were muddy, crowded, and often smelled like livestock, and yet they were miracles of human organisation. Now, imagine those earliest cities speaking to you directly, in the words of the people who lived there. In the midnight switch world, Sumer's thousands of unread or barely understood clay tablets are suddenly no longer silent. The scribbles that look like tiny bird tracks pressed into wet clay suddenly unspool into stories, accounts, arguments, confessions. Uruk, often considered the world's first true city, has always been known for its monumental architecture and the epic of its legendary king Gilgamesh. But that's the highlight reel version of the city's story. In reality, most of what's written on Sumerian tablets isn't epic poetry. It's receipts, contracts, tax records. Still, even these mundane texts can tell us more than we expect. Who married whom, who owned which fields, what disputes dragged on for years. If the switch had flipped centuries ago, we might have known entire networks of trade, personal feuds, and political rivalries. The authoritative fact here, the earliest known writing system, cuneiform, appeared in Sumer around 3200 BCE. But despite over a century of scholarship, thousands of cuneiform tablets remain untranslated in museum storage. Some are because of lack of resources, others because the script is damaged, idiosyncratic, or written in obscure dialects that only a few experts can tackle. And here's your odd fact. One of the oldest known jokes in history is Sumerian. It dates to around 1900 BCE and reads, "Something which has never occurred since time immemorial. A young woman did not fart in her husband's lap." It's an unexpected reminder that ancient people were not solemn marble busts. They laughed, they teased, they had a sense of humour that can still make us smirk 4,000 years later. Now picture the hypothesis. Buried in those unread tablets might be direct eyewitness accounts of great floods, city collapses and migrations, events we now reconstruct from archaeology and myth. Historians are still debating whether the Sumerian king list's flood narrative reflects a real, catastrophic event in Mesopotamian history, or whether it's a political device to legitimize certain rulers. An untranslated tablet might contain the diary of someone who saw it happen, describing not only the waters but the chaos afterward. With the midnight switch, we wouldn't just have the elite voices anymore. Often, the texts we've translated are the works of professional scribes, commissioned by temples or kings. But ordinary people, traders, artisans, farmers, also wrote, scratched or stamped messages into clay. What if those voices could be heard too? Imagine reading a small lopsided tablet from 3000 BCE that says simply, "My neighbour has stolen my donkey again." The humanness of it collapses the millennia instantly. But the past isn't always charming. There's an unease in imagining all of Sumer's records suddenly laid bare. It would mean direct access to slave ledgers, brutal punishments, and evidence of corruption on a scale that might change how we talk about the cradle of civilization. And yet, Would that be so surprising? We often idealize early cities as noble experiments in cooperation. In reality, they were messy, often unjust and full of contradictions, just like ours. I can see you now, drifting in that half-awake state, imagining yourself walking through Uruk's bustling market streets. The air is heavy with the smell of baking bread and animal dung. Merchants shout prices for barley and beer. Someone is selling a carved figurine of a goddess, someone else a bag of dried fish. Above it all, a scribe sits at a low table, pressing symbols into clay for a client who can't write. In our real world, you might walk past without knowing what those marks mean. But in the midnight switch world, you hear every word, like a voice whispering in your ear. And think about what that does to archaeology. Entire scholarly careers have been spent arguing over the meaning of one half-broken inscription. Suddenly, all those disputes could be settled or rendered irrelevant in seconds. One museum in Baghdad holds tens of thousands of tablets, many never even catalogued. In our imagined world, every one of them would be not just catalogued but comprehensible. You'd know exactly what happened in that temple meeting in 2100 BCE, or why a certain shipment of copper went missing. This flood of understanding would have consequences beyond history books. Modern nations often draw political legitimacy from their connection to ancient civilizations. If newly translated texts suggested that cultural inheritance was more complex, that multiple peoples laid claim to the same heritage, borders and national identities could be challenged. But for now, here in the soft dark of your room, it's just you and the idea. The first cities, speaking in their own words. The stone and mud brick streets are gone, but the voices remain, pressed into clay, waiting to be read. Tonight, in your mind, they finally are. The air inside an ancient tomb is the kind of stillness you don't often encounter in life. It is thick, stale, and smells faintly of dust and stone. For thousands of years, those walls have been silent, at least silent to us. Carved into them, painted across them in mineral pigments, are lines of symbols that to an untrained eye look decorative, almost ornamental. But in the midnight switch world, they aren't just beautiful patterns anymore, they are voices. The walls speak, and you can understand every word. We think we know Egypt. Tour guides in the Valley of the Kings point to the painted scenes of pharaohs offering gifts to the gods, to the neat vertical columns of hieroglyphs, and explain the general story. But a shocking amount of ancient Egyptian writing is still ambiguous. Even though Champollion unlocked the basics in the 1820s, regional dialects, cryptographic inscriptions, and informal graffiti remain partly or wholly undeciphered. A sudden universal translation would make the tombs less like museums and more like memoirs. The authoritative fact here, many Egyptian tombs, particularly those of lesser nobles and workers, contain inscriptions that have never been translated. The priority has often gone to royal tombs, leaving vast amounts of more ordinary history untouched. Inscriptions from workmen's villages like Deir el-Medina hint at personal lives, lists of tools, complaints about foremen, notes of sick days. These have as much to say about ancient Egypt as the grand speeches of the pharaohs. And the odd fact, in 2012, researchers discovered ancient Egyptian graffiti inside the Great Pyramid, painted not in public view, but in hidden chambers above the king's chamber. It includes the names of work crews and references to the pharaoh Khufu. In other words, some of the earliest pyramid inscriptions are just workers leaving their mark, not sacred hieroglyphs. Imagine finding out that half the mysterious symbols inside other monuments are also someone's casual doodles. Now the hypothesis: within the unopened or untranslated inscriptions of Egypt may lie records of medical practices far ahead of their time. Historians are still debating whether the Ebers Papyrus, an ancient Egyptian medical text, contains genuinely effective treatments or mostly symbolic magic. If a newly translated wall text described an herbal remedy that matched modern pharmacology, it could rewrite the history of medicine. In your mind, walk into a burial chamber. On one wall you see a list of goods placed with the deceased: jars of beer, loaves of bread, fine linen. On another, you read a hymn to Osiris, but this time you catch the subtle political undertones, a line suggesting that the deceased once brokered peace between two rival factions. A corner, barely noticed before, turns out to hold the equivalent of a will, with specific instructions for passing down land and livestock. In one sentence, the ancient and the familiar touch hands. Not everything you'd read would be solemn. Perhaps in the antechamber, a servant has scratched a complaint about the poor quality of the last batch of wine, or a builder has left a warning, half practical, half joking, not to lean too hard on the west wall because it's not as strong as it looks. These glimpses make the long dead not just names in a list, but people you could imagine meeting. But the unsettling part? Tomb inscriptions might also reveal truths that make us uncomfortable. Imagine reading, in a pharaoh's own words, a justification for enslaving thousands during a monument project, or finding out that a celebrated queen was quietly erased from official records after a scandal. The past is rarely as tidy as the polished narratives we display in textbooks. You might be thinking about the practical chaos of such a discovery. Egyptologists, already protective of their sites, would suddenly have to contend with journalists, conspiracy theorists, and opportunists flocking to Egypt for fresh revelations. Some would cherry-pick translations to support their favourite, alternative history theories. Others might try to suppress damaging information. The flood of clarity would be just as political as it would be academic. And yet, there's something irresistible about the idea of walking through a necropolis where every symbol speaks plainly to you. You would know the names of the people buried in unmarked shafts. You would understand why certain offerings were left and what stories the family wanted told. You might even hear, in your head, the cadence of a voice that hasn't been heard aloud in 3,000 years. In the midnight switch world, the tombs are no longer quiet. They're crowded with conversation, from the solemn recitations of funerary rites to the muttered complaints of workers and the tender farewells of family members. You stand in the middle of it all, eyes half closed, letting the voices of ancient Egypt flow over you like the Nile in flood. The streets are narrow here, and the air is thick with the scent of something unfamiliar. Maybe spices, maybe the damp, earthy smell of river water drying on clay bricks. This is the Indus Valley, around 4,000 years ago. The city you're standing in could be Harappa, or Mohenjo-Daro, or one of the many smaller settlements scattered along the rivers and trade routes. In daylight, its buildings rise in clean lines of baked brick, carefully aligned with the cardinal directions. In the deep quiet of night, its walls are etched with marks, small, neat symbols unlike anything in Mesopotamia or Egypt. For centuries, those marks have been a mystery. But in the midnight switch world, you can read every one. It is one of archaeology's most stubborn puzzles, the Harappan script still undeciphered despite over 100 years of study. It appears on seals, pottery, tools, even tiny pieces of jewellery. The authoritative fact is that these symbols, over 400 distinct ones, were used between roughly 2600 and 1900 BCE. They're too short to be simple pictograms, too varied to be mere decoration, and yet too brief in most surviving examples to give linguists the long patterns they need for decoding. The largest known inscription has just 17 characters. In our real world, that brevity is a locked door. In the imagined one, the lock has fallen away. Now you can stroll past a row of houses and see names scratched onto door lintels, almost like ancient street numbers. You pass a warehouse and find a clay seal pressed with a symbol that, to your surprise, is a trader's logo and the short phrase, "Grain from the East Dock, checked and weighed." At a corner stall, a merchant's seal casually records not only his goods, but his hometown and the river he uses for transport. And here's your odd fact. When archaeologists first uncovered Mohenjo-Daro's Great Bath, they speculated it might have been a swimming pool. Later, most agreed it was for ritual bathing, part of a complex cultural or religious practice. But without written records, no one could say for certain. In the Midnight Switch version, a plaque at the bath's entrance simply reads, "All visitors must wash before entering the meeting hall. The practical and the sacred side by side." The hypothesis worth drifting into here: what if the Harappan script revealed that this civilization was not only literate but bilingual? Historians are still debating whether the Indus Valley people traded extensively with Mesopotamia through direct contact or via intermediaries. A fully translated set of trade seals could show Harappan merchants recording their wares in both their own language and Akkadian, suggesting a far more interconnected ancient world than we allow for. Walking deeper into the city, you notice something else. There is order here. Streets are laid out in a grid. Drains run beneath the walkways covered by stone slabs. Houses have standardized brick sizes suggesting shared regulations. In our actual timeline, these are physical clues that the Harappan civilization was well organized. But now, the writing confirms it. You read municipal decrees posted at intersections, rules about sanitation, taxation, and market days. A clay tablet lists the schedule for public wells, ensuring water is shared fairly. You also discover personal notes, things no one expected to find. A child's scratched symbol on a pottery shard claiming it as their own. A quick message left for a friend. Meet at the west gate before sunset. A lover's name hidden at the base of a doorway, carved so small only someone who knew where to look would see it. But this new clarity would bring unsettling truths too. Imagine if the inscriptions revealed that the collapse of the Indus Valley wasn't caused solely by environmental change, as many theories suggest, but by internal conflict, factionalism, uprisings, or an epidemic that led to mass desertion. And what if the texts mentioned contacts with distant cultures we thought were separated by centuries or continents? Every new line of writing could rearrange the map of the ancient world in your mind. There would be political consequences as well. In the present day, the heritage of the Indus Valley is claimed by multiple modern nations, each eager to see its own narrative confirmed. A full translation could shift those narratives dramatically. Some discoveries might support one national claim, others might undermine them entirely. And then there's the emotional side of it. Hearing, at last, the voices of a civilization that left behind no monuments as tall as the pyramids, no epic carved in stone, but which quietly built some of the most sophisticated cities of the ancient world. Imagine standing in Mohenjo-Daro's main street, able to read every scrap of text around you. The city is alive again, not just as bricks and walls, but as a network of human intentions, recorded in strokes of a stylus or cuts of a chisel. In the midnight switch night, you don't just visit Harappa, you listen to it. And in doing so, you realize that history has never been silent at all. It has only been waiting for you to understand the words. You find yourself beneath a patient, amber flame in a room lined with shelves that hold bones the colour of old tea. Ox scapulae and turtle plastrons lie polished flat, drilled with tiny hollows, their faces stitched with knife-cut characters. The air smells faintly of dust and something mineral, as if a thunderstorm has just passed through stone. These are Shang oracle bones, tools for asking questions of heat and chance, where cracks with a grammar and fire the ink. An attendant lifts a sliver of bran to a pit. The bone answers with a sharp cry, a crack racing like lightning across a dry riverbed. The diviner reads with his eyes, then carves the verdict. Auspicious, inauspicious, uncertain. Tonight you catch the whole cycle at once. The question, the crack, the judgment, and sometimes the later note. It rained. The hunt failed. The queen's tooth ceased aching. Authoritative fact. The Anyang corpus, tens of thousands of bones from the late Shang capital in northern Henan, forms the earliest substantial body of Chinese writing, dated to roughly the 13th through 11th centuries BCE. Many record sexagenary dates, the names of diviners, and kings such as Wu Ding. Thousands remain fragmentary or only partly read. You trace in imagination the angular strokes that will become the ancestors of modern characters. Officials worry about weather and war and tendon-strained horses. A ruler asks whether an ancestor will accept millet or prefers a richer offering. The court feels anxious yet methodical, testing tomorrow with repeated questions and logging outcomes. Superstition and bookkeeping hold hands. There is a concrete hinge in the modern story. In 1899, the Beijing scholar Wang Yirong was prescribed dragon bones from an apothecary. On them he noticed carved signs and realized they were writing. That recognition opened a century of excavation and debate. In the Midnight Switch version, you watch him tilt a plastron into a window's light, the forgotten script stepping forward like someone who had been standing in the doorway all along. Odd fact. For years before their origin was traced to fields near Anyang, these inscribed bones were sold to pharmacies by the sack and ground into medicine. The script of kings passed through mortars and pestles, swallowed with water. History, for a time, was an ingredient. A century of fieldwork followed that recognition. In the late 1920s and 1930s, systematic excavations at the ruins of Yinshu, near modern Anyang, uncovered palatial foundations, bronze foundries, chariot pits, and tens of thousands of inscribed fragments. Archaeologist Li Ji planned broad trenches that tied texts to buildings and graves. Epigraphers such as Dong Zuobin then grouped inscriptions by the names of diviners and kings, arranging them into sequences that read like court diaries. Under the switch, their scaffolding becomes transparent. Charges, the questions, prognostications, the readings, and verifications, the outcomes, lock together cleanly. You can follow a single regnal year as if paging through a ledger. Early rains missed, a border skirmish flaring, an ancestor appeased with a specific cut of meat. Historians are still debating whether writing in China began only with the late Shang, or whether ghostly predecessors existed in earlier centres like Erlitou. A fully legible, context-anchored sequence at Yinshu would let those arguments pick up or fall away on the strength of dates and hands rather than hunches. The bones are not only voices, they are timestamps, and time, once set in order, rearranges what we think we know. Questions arrive like soft knocks on time's door. Will rain come before the third moon? Should the army move west against the Rong? Is the king's toothache caused by an ancestor who is displeased? Will the queen's child be born fortunate? There are hunts for rhinoceros, floods to avert, sacrifices to confirm. The rhythm feels intimate, like hearing someone think aloud and write it down. Archaeology meets writing in small, steady sparks. Anyang's royal cemetery, with chariot burials and bronze workshops, reappears in the text. A scapular names Lady Fu Hao, general, priestess, royal consort, whose tomb found in 1976 held weapons, bronzes, jades, and human and canine sacrifices. One line notes, "If Fu Hao commands the chariots, will the West be pacified?" A later hand records the result. The bones do not look dramatic to a passerby. In your ear they are a drumline. Hypothesis to hold gently. A complete translation might reveal an observational astronomy as systematic as the divination, referencing eclipses, comets, or the turning of the dipper that tied right to a sky clock. Historians are still debating whether Shang elites measured time primarily through omen cycles, or whether a parallel empirical calendar was also kept in script we have yet to assemble. If a cluster of inscriptions correlated crack rituals with known celestial events, that argument would tilt. You start to recognize hands. Certain graphs ligature when space is tight. One diviner favours straight angles, another likes hooked tails. In the switch-lit archive you can plot a human network. Diviner Bin appears in rainy months, Diviner K in war seasons. A junior hand imitates an elder and gets it charmingly wrong. Scripts are not systems so much as people's habits fossilised. The darker seam remains. The bones speak of sacrifice without euphemism. Pits of victims are tallied, captives from campaigns, offerings for burials, propitiations for drought. Archaeology told you this already, but the king's unblinking line, "We will use 10, feels different than a modern report. You step nearer, not to pardon, not to condemn, but to witness. The switch grants clarity. It does not promise comfort. Yet tenderness threads through. A compact plastron describes the king's anxious nights during the queen's illness. Another notes with relief that a newborn's first cry was strong. On a burned edge, someone squeezed a personal flourish, long misread as decoration. Now legible, it reveals a nickname, Little Reed, perhaps an apprentice diviner proud enough to sign. The past keeps leaving signatures in margins, trusting a stranger to notice. More authoritative details brighten the room. Many entries are precise to the day in the sexagenary cycle. Some include audits. Auspicious. We sacrificed a cow. It rained at dusk. Those after entries tie prediction to outcome, making the archive a ledger of tested beliefs. In its own way, the court ran experiments, imperfect and theologically framed, but experiments nonetheless. Now your ear turns to borders. What lay beyond Shang fields and rivers? The inscriptions name rival groups and tribute bearers. They list exotic goods, cowries, jade, feathers, and perhaps a word for horses that still stirs arguments. Historians are still debating whether such terms signify distant polities, mobile confederations, or convenient labels for others. With full legibility, that debate could shift. If one bone narrated the arrival of envoys with coastal shells and mountain copper in the same season, you could sketch a trade wind right across a map you thought closed. Odd corners keep catching the lamplight. A run of questions about silkworms. If we move the mulberry frames, will the worms thrive? Several about beer. Is the mash pure? And later, the mash spoiled? Someone asks whether drilling a new well is favourable. The great machinery of a Bronze Age court squeaks in places you recognise from your own life. Everydayness is the bridge you didn't know you needed. Let a second practical hypothesis settle. A fully read corpus might expose technological recipes, bronze alloy ratios, heat treatment hints, casting sequences, veiled inside ritual phrasing. If smiths encoded shop wisdom in sacred language, and you could reproduce a bell's steady tone from those ratios, you would hear metallurgy become music again. After the scholar's thrill comes the civic tremor. What does it do to a modern nation to hear its earlier states speak without gaps? Pride, surely. Also complication. New texts could surface regional variants later dynasties smoothed over. They might restore voices the long river submerged, women like Fu Hao, artisans who signed in strokes, foreign names later provincialized. To translate is to move authority from legend to ledger. You remain under the gentle lamp, the fragment warm from your hand, the room's quiet, pleasantly crowded. The line from burnt plastron to a pen across a grocery list is thinner than it looks. With the switch thrown, you are allowed to hear continuity and to accept the little unease that comes with it. Outside, snow ticks against a shutter. You watch the diviner's final strokes dry. You imagine the king exhaling. You return the shard to its tray. The oracle bones never wanted to be oracles forever. They wanted to be read. Tonight, at last, they are. The air is thinner here and your breathing slows to match it. The mountains around you are immense walls of stone, their peaks catching the sun in ways that make the snow blaze like white fire. You're standing in the Andes centuries before the arrival of the Spanish. Somewhere in a storage room of an Inca administrative center, the walls are hung not with scrolls or tablets, but with cords, bundles of twisted, dyed strings hanging in ordered rows. These are quipus, the knotted records of the Inca Empire. You reach out and touch one, a thick central cord with dozens of pendant cords dangling from it, each a slightly different color, each marked with knots tied at precise intervals. In our world, scholars can read some of the numeric patterns, taxes, census counts, harvest yields, but the rest is still uncertain, a code without a Rosetta Stone. In the Midnight Switch world, the knots tell their stories instantly, and the voices of the Andes begin to hum in your ears. The authoritative fact is this: quipus, sometimes spelled quipus, were used for record-keeping across the Inca realm, from the Pacific coast to the Amazon fringe. They could record numbers in a base 10 system, with different types of knots representing units, tens, hundreds, and so on. But there's strong evidence they recorded more than just numbers, possibly names, places, or narratives. Historians are still debating whether quipus were a form of writing in the full sense or a mnemonic system for trained specialists called quipu kamayuk. In the midnight switch moment, that debate ends, not because we decide it by vote, but because the chords themselves start speaking. You run your fingers along a yellow strand, and it recounts the arrival of maize shipments from the Sacred Valley. A deep red chord records the names of families in a nearby village, noting who owes labour service this season. Another, in alternating bands of blue and white, tells a story of a local flood, how the river rose suddenly during planting, and how the community rebuilt. The odd fact here is that when the Spanish first encountered quipus, they sometimes used them as legal evidence in colonial courts. Indigenous witnesses would bring a quipu to testify about debts or agreements, and a trained quipu reader would read it aloud for the judge. Eventually, fearing they might encode heretical or rebellious messages, colonial authorities burned thousands of them. The few hundred surviving examples are scattered in museums and collections around the world. Hypothesis: if every quipu could be read today, we might discover entire genres of literature and history, epics, genealogies, treaty records, that have been invisible for centuries. We might also find traces of pre-Inca cultures encoded in older quipus, revealing a continuity of Andean record-keeping far deeper than the Inca Empire itself. You imagine walking into an Inca kolka, a state storage building, high in the mountains. Rows of quipus hang from wooden beams, each a ledger for a different province. One cord records the amount of dried fish stored for the winter. Another notes the exact number of chicha beer jars prepared for an upcoming festival. But in this midnight switch reality, some cords contain personal notes, a record of a marriage agreement between two families, or a reminder of a promise made to a local deity. And then there are the cords that carry stories. A thick, intricately knotted quipu might recount the deeds of a famous general, his victories stitched into the arrangement of colours and knots. Another could describe the journey of envoys to the coast, carrying spondylus shells back to the highlands. These were never just numbers. They were archives, but in a form that survived on fibre instead of clay or stone. There's a strange intimacy in knowing that the very act of reading these knots would require you to touch them, to let the story travel from fibre to fingertip. It's different from reading a carved inscription. It's more like handling a piece of someone's clothing and realizing it carries their voice. But unsettling truths would surface too. What if a quipu revealed that certain provinces had been punished harshly for resisting Inca rule, or that tribute demands were far heavier than oral tradition admits? Or if the cords confirmed rumours of political intrigue within the Sapa Inca's own family? The past, once translated, doesn't protect reputations. The implications for modern identity would be huge. Indigenous communities in Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador and Chile might gain an unbroken historical record in their own voices, reshaping the way national histories are written. At the same time, conflicting claims over heritage and interpretation could arise. Some knowledge might be embraced, other truths might be too sharp to hold comfortably. Now imagine standing in an open plaza during an Inca festival. Brightly dressed officials carry quipus like banners, their cords swaying in the wind. In our world, you'd see only the colours and knots. In the midnight switch world, you'd hear the crowd reciting the history encoded in those cords, as if the entire empire's memory were unravelling itself into sound. The wind catches the ends of the cords, and for a moment it feels as though the mountains themselves are whispering. You close your eyes and let the voices of the keepers pass through you, centuries of hands tying, twisting and knotting the thread so that one day, perhaps this night, they would be read again. The Pacific stretches in every direction, a sheet of shifting blue under a sun so bright it feels almost metallic. You are far from any continent, now approaching a small island whose cliffs rise sharply from the water. The air is warm, the waves crash with steady rhythm, and the first thing you notice on shore are the silent sentinels, the moai statues, their faces tilted toward the horizon as if waiting for something that never came. This is Rapa Nui, or Easter Island, and hidden here is one of the most enigmatic writing systems on Earth, the RongoRongo script. In our world, no one has been able to fully read it. A few symbols seem to represent plants or animals, perhaps calendar markers, but the grammar, the structure, the voice, they remain silent. In the midnight switch world, the moment your eyes meet those looping, almost playful glyphs carved into wooden tablets, you understand them instantly, and they begin to speak. The authoritative fact is this: Rongorongo was first reported to Europeans in the 19th century, long after much of the island's population had been devastated by slave raids and disease. The surviving tablets, fewer than 30 known examples, are scattered in museums around the world. Their texts run in a peculiar reverse boustrophodon pattern. You read one line left to right, then rotate the tablet 180 degrees to read the next line in the opposite direction. But without a key, their meaning has remained out of reach. Now, with the switch thrown, you hear chants encoded in the flowing lines, genealogies tracing back hundreds of years, agricultural instructions for planting sweet potatoes, hymns to deities whose names have faded from oral tradition. Some tablets are practical, records of fishing quotas, notes on bird egg collection from the offshore islets. Others are ceremonial, designed to be sung in cycles during festivals that aligned with the moon and the arrival of migratory birds. The odd fact is that when missionaries first arrived, they collected Rongorongo tablets from the locals, but misunderstanding their value sometimes repurposed the wood. A few surviving inscriptions are on the backs of broken European oars, carved over with indigenous writing. The words of a lost tradition were literally scratched into colonial debris. Hypothesis: if Rongorongo could be fully read, it might contain pre-contact history of the island, perhaps even an account of the first voyages from Polynesia that reached these remote shores. Historians are still debating whether Rapa Nui's decline before European arrival was primarily due to ecological collapse, internal conflict, or outside interference. A first-hand written record could resolve, or complicate, that question beyond recognition. You walk into a thatched meeting house where one of these tablets rests on a carved stand. The wood is dark and polished by countless hands, the glyphs cut in flowing relief: birds, fish, human figures, geometric curls. In the midnight switch world, you hear them as a chorus, a layered memory, part chant, part ledger, part poem. One line speaks of a time when the islanders, sent canoes far west to find stone, trading with neighbours whose names you've never heard. Another warns of famine years, when the wind shifted and the seas yielded little. There are personal stories too. A fisherman recounting the loss of his brother in a sudden squall, a family celebrating the birth of a child with a feast of cooked taro and roast seabird. The script turns out not to be solely the domain of priests and chiefs, but a shared cultural fabric in which daily life and sacred ritual are knotted together. And then, the unsettling part. Some tablets carry accounts of warfare, raids between clans, and punishments severe enough to make you pause. In our modern telling, Rapa Nui is often portrayed as a cautionary tale about environmental overreach, but the translated Rongorongo texts would add nuance. They speak of deliberate planting strategies, cooperative management of resources, and conflict born not only from scarcity, but from ambition and pride. The political shockwaves would be immediate. Polynesian history would be rewritten to include a literate tradition that spanned vast distances. The view of Rapa Nui as an isolated outlier would be replaced by a map of connections, trading voyages, shared mythologies, perhaps even synchronized calendars linking islands thousands of kilometers apart. Now imagine standing at dawn, the moai at your back, holding a tablet and reading aloud the words carved by someone who watched the same sunrise centuries ago. The gulls wheel above, the surf roars against the lava rock, and for the first time the island's voice is no longer imagined or reconstructed. It is clear, confident, and utterly alive. You close your eyes, and it feels as though the statues are no longer staring into the distance but listening. The world feels suddenly smaller when you realise that in the Late Bronze Age, around 1200 BCE, entire civilizations across the Mediterranean and Near East collapsed within a generation. Palaces burned, trade routes withered, populations scattered. It's one of history's great turning points, and even today, historians list it in cautious, almost frustrated tones, because the records from that time are fragmentary, biased, or absent altogether. In the Midnight Switch world, that absence is no longer a void. Every tablet, inscription, and letter from those fading kingdoms is now fully legible. The noise of the collapse becomes a chorus. You're in the palace archive of Ugarit, a port city on the Syrian coast. In our world, its destruction layer preserved hundreds of clay tablets, many in Akkadian and Ugaritic. Some have been read, but others, damaged, eroded, written in local hands no one has mastered, have resisted translation. In the Midnight Switch moment, those broken lines fill in. A letter from a desperate king to his ally reads, "The enemy ships are already here. Our fields burn behind us. Send grain, send soldiers, send something before the gates fall." You can almost hear the panic in the wedge-shaped strokes. The authoritative fact, the Late Bronze Age collapse was a widespread breakdown affecting Mycenaean Greece, Hittite Anatolia, Egypt's New Kingdom, and many smaller states between. Archaeologists see signs of destruction, depopulation, and the end of a long-distance trade in tin and copper, the lifeblood of bronze making. Written records are rare and often abrupt, like a radio cutting out mid-broadcast. The odd fact, one of the most famous surviving records is from Egypt, carved on the walls of Pharaoh Ramses III's mortuary temple at Medinet Habu. It boasts of his victory over the mysterious Sea Peoples, describing battles both on land and at sea. But the inscription is pure propaganda. It says nothing about Egypt's internal struggles, the famine, or the labour strikes that plagued Ramses' reign. In our imagined instant decoding, the propaganda would be joined by private, candid reports, scribes admitting the treasury was empty, or priests noting that offerings had stopped. Hypothesis: fully readable archives from Hattusa, capital of the Hittites, or the still undeciphered linear tablets from Crete might reveal coordinated migrations, trade embargoes, or political betrayals behind the collapse. Historians are still debating whether the fall was caused by climate change, internal revolt, foreign invasions, or a combination of all three. One well-placed inscription could tilt the argument decisively. You step through the ruins of Mycenae, the Lion Gate looming above. Archaeologists have found fragmentary tablets here too, in Linear B, deciphered, and in other scripts that remain cryptic. In our world, the surviving texts often read like inventories, grain, oil, textiles. But now you read the margins, where a scribe recorded rumours of unrest in distant cities, or noted that the coastal watch had sighted strange ships. A clay fragment that once seemed trivial turns out to be an eyewitness account of the first landing of a Sea People's fleet. The collapse was not quiet. In the midnight switch world, letters fly between cities in their last days, Ugarit calling to Cyprus for help, Cyprus calling to Egypt, Egypt sending guarded replies. You read shipping manifests that abruptly end mid-season, taxation records showing grain shortages year after year, contracts cancelled without explanation. And you also read the human details, an official in Hattusa lamenting that his children have been sent inland for safety, a scribe in Thebes noting that the festival was small this year, for the musicians have gone to war. But the new clarity would not only fill in the drama, it would complicate it. What if the text revealed that some cities were abandoned willingly, their populations migrating to join new political or economic systems elsewhere? What if the collapse was, in part, a reshaping rather than an outright fall? That would challenge centuries of framing this period as a dark age. Modern politics might also feel the shock. Nations that trace their identity to these ancient cultures could see their heroic origin stories altered. A letter showing a revered king begging for mercy from an enemy could be as destabilizing today as it was humiliating then. And then there are the mysteries we didn't know we were missing. In a storeroom in the Levant, you find a tablet whose inscription names a port city lost to history, along with its location, far from where any map has placed it. In a tomb in Anatolia, an undeciphered stele now tells of a treaty between two kingdoms that no archaeologist had ever suspected existed. Standing amid the ruins, you realize that the late Bronze Age was not a silent catastrophe. It was a time when thousands of voices shouted, pleaded, and bargained. We just couldn't hear them before. Now, in the Midnight Switch world, they are all speaking at once, and their words are as full of fear, pride, and stubborn hope as any you might hear today. The Sahara is not only a desert of sand, it is a desert of time. Beneath its dunes and along its hidden valleys, history sleeps in both stone and ink. Far to the south, beyond the reach of the camel caravans, lie the river kingdoms, the mountain fortresses, and the bustling towns of ancient Sub-Saharan Africa. We tend to picture Africa's past in fragments: Egypt's pyramids, Mali's gold, Ethiopia's rock-hewn churches, but the rest is often left as a haze of oral tradition. That haze is misleading. The continent has a deep written heritage, much of it unread. In the Midnight Switch world, the unread parts are no longer silent. The authoritative fact is that Africa is home to numerous ancient scripts beyond the famous Egyptian hieroglyphs: Meroitic in Nubia, Ge'ez in Ethiopia, Nsibidi in southeastern Nigeria, Tifinagh among the Tuareg, and others now extinct. Some, like Ge'ez, survive in liturgical use. Others, like Meroitic, remain only partially deciphered despite decades of study. The Meroitic script, used in the Kingdom of Kush from the 2nd century BCE to the 4th century CE, has been transliterated but not fully translated. Its vocabulary is still largely unknown. Now imagine walking among the ruined pyramids of Meroe in Sudan. In our world, the inscriptions carved into sandstone stele are partly mysterious, their meanings reconstructed from context and guesswork. In the Midnight Switch world, you run your hand over the chisel marks, and the meaning blooms. This temple was built in the reign of Queen Amanitor, for the god Apedamac, and for the prosperity of the harvest. The wall that was a puzzle an hour ago now tells its story plainly. The odd fact: the Meroitic language is known mostly from monumental inscriptions and funerary texts, but also from graffiti. Archaeologists have found casual messages scratched into walls by travellers, short phrases that might say, "I was here," or "safe journey." Entire, scholarly conferences have debated the meaning of such tiny fragments. In the instant decoding moment, the debates dissolve into smiles and perhaps a little embarrassment. Hypothesis: a fully readable Meroitic corpus might reveal trade links extending far deeper into Central Africa than we imagine. Historians are still debating whether the Kushite state traded directly with equatorial regions or relied on middlemen. Inscriptions mentioning goods, routes, or distant ports could redraw the economic map of the ancient world. Beyond Nubia, the continent's written heritage broadens. In the forests of what is now Nigeria and Cameroon, the pictographic Sibidi script was used for centuries in secret societies, on court records, and in personal correspondence. Much of it has never been made public, even today, because it carries ceremonial and spiritual weight. In the midnight switch scenario, every Ensabidi symbol speaks, telling not just the public stories but the guarded, esoteric ones, an ethical question in itself. Travel further west to the medieval libraries of Timbuktu, where thousands of manuscripts in Arabic and Ajami, African languages written in Arabic script, lie unread, some because of linguistic barriers, others because of damage. In our world, restoration and translation work is slow, hindered by funding and political instability. In the midnight switch world, every page speaks. Records of court cases, astronomical treatises, medical recipes, trade contracts, personal letters. You read of caravans bringing salt from the Sahara in exchange for gold from the forests, and you read of poets composing verses about love and faith in a city that Europeans once dismissed as myth. And there is Ethiopia, where Ge'ez manuscripts fill church treasuries. Ge'ez is deciphered, but countless manuscripts remain untranslated or barely studied. Some contain unique local histories, others moral tales that travelled from distant lands and were reshaped in African idioms. Now they are all open to you, their pages murmuring like a market in full swing. But there are unsettling revelations too. What if newly readable inscriptions in the Sahara described a period of political dominance by a kingdom no one today claims, or wants to claim? What if the manuscripts of Timbuktu revealed alliances or conflicts with European or Middle Eastern powers centuries before official histories admit? In the modern world, such knowledge could strengthen pride or spark disputes. Standing in the desert night, you picture a caravan halting under a sky littered with stars. Traders unload their camels, and by the firelight a scribe takes out a tablet or a sheet of parchment to record the day's exchange. That scribe knew his words might be read in the capital. He did not imagine they might also be read thousands of years later by someone from another world entirely. The wind shifts, and you hear the whisper of pages turning, stone being traced, cords being unrolled. Africa's voices have always been there, layered, multilingual, stretching from the Nile to the Cape. In the midnight switch world you hear them all at once, and the silence you once thought you knew is gone forever. The streets are eerily still, frozen in the moment when the sky turned black and the air became fire. You are in Herculaneum, 79 CE, in the shadow of Vesuvius. The eruption that buried Pompeii also sealed this smaller seaside town under a thick, suffocating blanket of volcanic mud. It crushed roofs, trapped people where they stood, and smothered entire libraries. That is how, nearly 2,000 years later, archaeologists found something almost miraculous. Hundreds of tightly rolled papyrus scrolls in a villa believed to have belonged to the family of Julius Caesar's father-in-law. They are carbonized, charred black, as fragile as burnt leaves. Most have never been read, not because they are lost, but because they are too delicate to open. In the midnight switch world, that barrier dissolves. The rolls unfold in your mind as easily as fresh parchment. The faded letters inked on them blaze into perfect clarity, and the voices trapped inside those cylinders of ash begin to speak. The authoritative fact: the so-called Villa of the Papyri contained more than 1,800 scrolls, most written in Greek. The few that have been read, using delicate mechanical unrolling in the 18th century or modern multispectral imaging, are largely works of Epicurean philosophy by Philodemus, a poet and philosopher of the 1st century BCE. But countless others remain sealed, their contents unknown. Some may be lost works by other ancient authors, potentially even Latin texts that would expand our understanding of Rome's intellectual world. Odd fact: in the 1750s, before anyone realized the scrolls could be unrolled, some were mistaken for lumps of charcoal and burned as fuel. Others were cut apart in failed attempts to flatten them, destroying lines of text forever. In our instant decoding reality, there is no risk of destruction. Every scroll can be read exactly as it was the day it was set down. Hypothesis: what if the unopened scrolls contain lost works by Aristotle, Sappho, or historians whose accounts of the late Republic have been only second-hand? Historians are still debating whether the Villa of the Papyri was a public library or a private philosophical retreat. A single, complete historical work found here could shift our understanding of Rome's politics, philosophy, and art. You picture stepping into the villa's peristyle garden in its final hours, statues along the colonnade, the blue line of the Bay of Naples beyond. Inside, in a small library room, the scrolls sit on shelves, some in wooden boxes. In our world, the extreme heat of the eruption both destroyed and preserved them. It carbonized the papyrus so that it would crumble at a touch, but also sealed the ink into a fragile stasis. In the midnight switch moment, you walk through the villa's library as if it were untouched by disaster. You lift a scroll and read. One contains a complete treatise on music theory from an unknown Roman composer, linking melodies to moral training. Another is a diary kept by a senator in the years before Caesar's assassination, an eyewitness account full of gossip, personal grudges, and small domestic details. A third scroll turns out to be a cookbook with elaborate recipes for feasts, including spices sourced from as far as India. Some scrolls surprise you with their mundanity. A bundle of letters between two minor officials debating the allocation of funds for repairing a harbour wall. A ledger of debts owed by the villa's owner, written in a sharp, impatient hand. The human texture emerges, not just the lofty ideas but the practicalities of running an estate and a life. And yet, unsettling truths surface too. Imagine reading a set of letters that confirm long-suspected political corruption, or a philosophical work advocating ideas we'd now find deeply troubling. The past doesn't tidy itself up to meet our approval. It comes whole, with all its contradictions. Beyond Herculaneum, the Midnight Switch unlocks every other carbonized or charred manuscript in the world. The library at Stabiae, fragmentary scrolls from Oxyrhynchus, even parchment scraps from medieval fires. The collective effect is dizzying. Gaps in literature, philosophy, and science that scholars have filled with conjecture for centuries now overflow with first-hand voices. You find yourself in the reading room of the National Library of Naples, where the Herculaneum scrolls are stored today. In our world, researchers pore over spectral images, tracing faint ink traces on screen. Here, you simply reach for a roll and let it speak. The voices are quiet but confident, as though they've been rehearsing their lines for 20 centuries. And you wonder, what will the modern world do with this knowledge? Will we publish it all at once? Or will there be temptations to withhold certain discoveries, manuscripts that undermine cherished histories, or works that shift credit for ideas from one culture to another? The smell of the papyrus is faint, like smoke carried from a distant fire. The words, however, are fresh, as if the ink has just dried. You realize you're not only reading across space, but across a span of silence so long it seemed permanent, until tonight. The wind never stops here. It sweeps across the grasslands in long, low sighs, rattling the bones of old campfires and tugging at the horsehair ropes of forgotten tents. This is the Eurasian steppe, a sea of grass that stretches from Hungary to Manchuria. For thousands of years, it was the highway of nomads, a place where mounted warriors and traders moved faster than any army of farmers could hope to follow. We know their names from the records of other people: Scythians, Sarmatians, Xiongnu, Huns, but their own voices, written in their own words, are mostly gone. In the Midnight Switch world, the scraps of text they left behind, etched on wood, bone, or metal, suddenly speak again. The authoritative fact is that while the nomadic cultures of the steppe were often portrayed as illiterate by sedentary neighbours, archaeology tells a more complex story. Some used adapted scripts from the cultures they traded with: Greek, Aramaic, Chinese. Others developed their own, like the old Turkic runiform script, found on stone stele and wooden slips in Mongolia, dating to the 8th century CE. But countless inscriptions, graffiti, and portable texts from earlier nomadic groups remain undeciphered or unstudied. You find yourself beside an old Kurgan burial mound. The burial goods, gold plaques, carved wooden bows, remnants of felt garments, have already been studied. But there is also a strip of birch bark with strange marks, once dismissed as meaningless decoration. In the Midnight Switch moment, it unravels into a message. This bow was made for the warrior Targetai, who rides with the clan of the Golden Horse. It is a name, a claim, a signature left for anyone who might understand. Odd fact, in 2013, archaeologists in the Altai Mountains found fragments of wooden tablets covered in an unknown script alongside the remains of a woman buried with Chinese silk and Persian beads. The find suggested long-distance contact, but the text has never been read. Now, with the switch, it tells of a marriage alliance between two clans hundreds of miles apart, sealed by an exchange of gifts that crossed half a continent. Hypothesis: if all steppe inscriptions could be read, we might trace entire migration routes in the words of those who travelled them. Historians are still debating whether certain barbarian invasions recorded by Rome and China were single large-scale migrations or waves of smaller groups joining forces temporarily. First-hand records could turn those swirling arrows on the maps into concrete, named journeys. You picture a Scythian chieftain dictating a message to be carved on a bronze mirror, a diplomatic gift to a Greek city-state, mixing his own tongue with borrowed Greek words to make the point clear. In another camp, a Xiongnu envoy records the contents of a caravan heading east: sacks of salt, bolts of cloth, strange fruit from lands beyond the desert. The steppe becomes less of a void between civilizations and more of a living corridor, its own cultures defining themselves in their own terms. And there are the poems, because in the Midnight Switch world you discover the steppe peoples wrote more than lists and treaties. A scratched bone pendant tells of a horse named Cloudbreaker, fastest in the clan. A wooden slip from a winter camp records the words to a song about the first fire sung when the snows closed the passes. The writing is practical, yes, but also personal, part of a web of tradition we've long assumed was only oral. Unsettling revelations appear as well. A stela in the Orkhan Valley, which in our world is fragmentary, now clearly records an alliance between two steppe confederations to raid a sedentary empire's border settlements, a calculated, deliberate act, not the random, barbarian violence described by their enemies. Another inscription describes the forced relocation of a defeated clan, their herds seized, their names struck from memory. Modern narratives would shift. Nations today that trace their roots to steppe ancestors might have to grapple with records showing their forebears as both protectors and conquerors, pragmatic traders and ruthless opportunists. In the steppe's own words, those contradictions sit side by side without apology. You stand on a ridge and feel the wind cut past you. Below, the grass moves in long waves, and you imagine riders crossing it in every direction, some with messages tied in pouches, others carrying whole histories scratched into wood. Those histories have been carried for centuries in silence, their meaning worn smooth by time. Tonight, in the Midnight Switch world, the wind carries them back, not as guesses, not as echoes, but as the voices of the people who lived and moved in the wide, unbounded country between continents. The air here is heavy and warm, carrying the scent of damp earth and frangipani. Somewhere above you, cicadas rattle in the canopy. The ruins are scattered among thick roots and flowering vines, broken towers of brick and stone, half hidden by the forest. This is Southeast Asia, a region whose ancient kingdoms rose and fell along rivers, coasts and mountain passes, leaving behind stone inscriptions that still speak in fragments. You know some of the names: Angkor, Srivijaya, Pagan, Funan. Others have been swallowed so thoroughly by time that their languages survive only as undeciphered carvings on a lintel or a stone stele, weathered by centuries of monsoon rain. In the Midnight Switch world, those carvings speak again. The authoritative fact: Southeast Asia's early history is recorded in multiple scripts, some indigenous, some adapted from India and China. Old Khmer, Pallava, Pew, Mon and Cham inscriptions have been partially or fully deciphered, but others, especially from early or remote kingdoms, remain mysterious. Inscriptions often appear on temple walls, foundation stele, or copper plates, but their vocabulary can be specialized, ritualistic, and difficult to interpret. You stand in the heart of Angkor Thom, the great capital of the Khmer Empire. The Bayon Temple's towers wear faces carved in serene smiles, but on a shaded wall, a weathered panel of script has long puzzled scholars. In our world, it's just a partially understood dedication, dates, names, a list of offerings. In the Midnight Switch moment, the text unfolds into a vivid account of a festival held to consecrate the temple. Thousands gathered, dancers performed stories from the Rimka, the king himself poured water over, the sacred lingam at dawn. The details are not just religious. They describe what the people ate, how the musicians were paid, and the routes the processions took through the city. The odd fact: in 2013, divers exploring near Sumatra found a stone inscription in Old Malay at the bottom of a riverbed. Its text was so worn it could only be guessed at, possibly relating to the maritime empire of Srivijaya. In the instant decoding world, it turns out to be a warning to ships entering the estuary, a mixture of religious invocation and practical trade regulations, part prayer, part customs notice. Hypothesis: reading every lost inscription could reveal that the Mandela model of Southeast Asian politics, loosely defined spheres of influence, was more structured than we think. Historians are still debating whether kingdoms like Srivijaya operated as centralized states or as flexible networks of ports. Inscriptions might detail tax systems, naval patrols, or alliances that would tip that argument. You move west into what was once the Pew city of Sri Ksetra in present-day Myanmar. Tall stone gateways lead into a grassy plain where fragmentary tablets lie half-buried. One, in the midnight switch moment, records the travels of a Buddhist monk who carried relics from India to the city, stopping at monasteries along the way. His description of routes and distances suddenly connects dots on ancient maps that were previously guesswork. Further south, in the forests of Champa, a cham stele from the 8th century CE tells not just of kings and wars, but of a drought that nearly ended the kingdom's control over its coastal lands. It names villages, wells, and reservoirs, real places that could still be traced today. The script's tone is both practical and poetic, like someone telling the story of survival to children who hadn't been born yet. Not every revelation is flattering. Some inscriptions describe the forced movement of entire communities to work on royal projects. Others speak of punitive campaigns against rebellious provinces, complete with lists of confiscated goods and captives. The grandeur of these kingdoms, once seen only through their architecture, now has a sharper human edge. In modern Southeast Asia, the political ripples would be immediate. Borders in this region have shifted countless times, and ancient inscriptions could become tools in present-day disputes over heritage, territory, and identity. The voices of long-dead kings might become part of living arguments. But in the stillness of the midnight switch world, you linger on the quieter lines. A temple wall in Laos records the donation of a small plot of rice field to support a monastery, made by a widow for the merit of her late husband. A copper plate from the Malay Peninsula preserves a promise by a coastal ruler to protect fishermen from pirates in exchange for a portion of their catch. These are not grand political manifestos. They are threads of ordinary life, woven into the great tapestry of the region's history. You step back from the wall, the jungle pressing in around you. The air hums with insects, and somewhere in the distance, a hornbill calls. The inscriptions shimmer in the filtered light, their words alive again for the first time in centuries. The kingdoms of Southeast Asia are no longer half-guessed outlines. They are vibrant, complicated, and very much alive in their own voices. The ocean here is not a border, it is a library, and every island is a page. In the daylight, the Pacific can look endless, dotted only with the white wakes of fishing canoes. At night, under a dome of stars so thick it feels solid, you realize it is a map. The ancestors of these islands read it fluently. They navigated by the tilt of constellations, the feel of currents against the hull, the taste of the wind. Their knowledge was stored not in bound volumes, but in chants, genealogies, and patterns woven into mats or tattooed on skin. Yet here and there, in carved boards, shell inlays, and even stone monuments, there are traces of written systems, half-deciphered, wholly mysterious. In the midnight switch world, these ghost libraries of the Pacific speak again. The authoritative fact, many Pacific cultures kept vast bodies of knowledge without alphabetic writing, but some developed mnemonic devices or proto-scripts. The stick charts of the Marshall Islands, for example, encode ocean swells and island positions in a web of sticks and shells. The petroglyphs of Hawaii, Easter Island, and New Caledonia show recurring symbols whose full meaning has been lost. Even in Micronesia there are records, some on palm leaves, marked with symbols that may have served as navigational or ceremonial texts. Now you're in the Caroline Islands, watching a navigator unroll a palm mat. In our world, anthropologists can only guess at its meaning, geometric shapes surrounded by lines and dots. In the midnight switch moment, the mat becomes a clear set of sailing instructions, which stars to follow when leaving in the wet season, which reef marks the turn toward a hidden atoll, where to wait for the winds to change. It's as precise as any printed chart, but made for memory, not for the eye alone. The odd fact, in some Polynesian islands, tattooing was not just decorative or symbolic, but functioned as a record of lineage and accomplishments, essentially a living manuscript. Some patterns were passed down through families, their meaning restricted to those initiated in the tradition. With the switch, the patterns on a preserved tattooed skin in a museum suddenly tell you the story of its wearer, their clan, voyages, victories, and the songs they were entitled to sing. Hypothesis: if all such encoded knowledge were fully translated, it might reveal not just local histories but a network of contact stretching from Southeast Asia to South America. Historians are still debating whether Polynesian voyagers reached the Americas before Europeans. A fully legible navigational record could settle that question and raise 100 new ones. You move on to the petroglyph fields of Hawaii. In our world, they're a mixture of identifiable figures, canoes, fish, human forms, and abstract shapes. In the Midnight Switch world, the shapes become captions and names: who made the voyage, what fish were caught, how the weather changed on the third day at sea. They are logbooks carved in lava. Farther south, on tiny atolls that barely break the surface, wooden boards from long-lost temples speak prayers for good harvests, chants for safe passage, and lists of tribute brought by neighbouring islands. In some cases, the carvings reveal conflicts, raids over fishing grounds, storms blamed on rival priests, acts of revenge that echo faintly in modern oral tradition. Not every recovered voice is gentle. On one island, a series of stone pillars bear markings long assumed to be purely decorative. Decoded, they turn out to record a law passed by a ruling chief, exiling an entire family accused of breaking a sacred taboo. The account is precise, naming each person and the place they were sent. In the present day, such revelations would ripple outward. Many Pacific communities are working to revive traditional navigation, dance, and crafts. Instant access to a complete written record could strengthen those revivals, but might also spark disputes over who owns certain songs, rituals, or fishing rites. The past is alive here, and once spoken, it will not easily be put back into silence. The midnight air smells of salt and flowers. You stand on a ridge overlooking a lagoon, and for the first time you see the Pacific as it might have been centuries ago. Not isolated islands, but a network of waypoints, each with its own archive of knowledge. These ghost libraries are not ghostly anymore. They are warm, lit, and full of voices that had been waiting, as patient as the tides, for you to listen. You tilt the lamp lower, and the vellum answers with a slow shine, the ink rising from cream like the grain of wood when rain darkens it. The library around you is thick with breath, oak, dust, a trace of beeswax, and every shelf holds books that once blinked back at inquisitors, kings, and bored novice monks. Some pages are open lies in beautiful hands, some are truths hiding behind toy box alphabets. Europe did not sleep through its so-called Dark Ages. It wrote and rewrote and hid and giggled in the margins while doing it. In the Midnight Switch world, the ciphers and private scripts are suddenly as legible as a shopping list, and the silence you had mistaken for ignorance turns out to be a habit of caution. You begin with a page that looks like polite Latin until you notice the vowels have gone walking. A cipher alphabet replaces them, little loops and thorns that only the scribe's friends could read. Merchants loved such things. So did abbots with opinions they preferred to circulate in small rooms. An index finger glides over a column of nonsense, and you hear a practical voice from the 14th century. Prices of woad and alum, a warning about a bad batch of saffron, a table of exchange rates for a fair at Champagne. Money learned to whisper long before it learned to sing. Authoritative fact: by the late Middle Ages, cryptographic techniques were already described in treatises like the Polygraphia of Johannes Trithemius, published 1518, a Benedictine abbot who explained substitution alphabets and steganography, concealing messages inside other texts. His earlier Steganographia, written at the turn of the 16th century, looked so much like a book of angelic conjurations that it was placed on the index of prohibited books. Centuries later, scholars demonstrated its methods were cryptographic schemes masquerading as magic. The wardrobe of secrecy had many costumes. You ease open a different binding and find shorthand, spiky, efficient strokes racing along the page like swallows. These are the descendants of Tyronian notes, the Roman stenographic system attributed to Cicero's freedman Tiro, kept alive in monasteries where sermons and legal depositions demanded speed. In the midnight switch moment, the cramped notes lilt into full sentences, a bishop telling a joke you're pretty sure he should not have told, a legal clerk recording with unseemly relish the exact insults traded by two feuding weavers. Odd fact: medieval margins are a zoo and a sideshow. Knights duel snails with terrific seriousness. Nuns harvest phallic-looking mandrakes. Monks draw rabbits hunting men. A scribe, warming his hands by a drawn fireplace, complains in Latin that the wind is wicked and the ink is grudging. The doodles are not a defect, they are a pulse. In our new clarity, a rabbit that looked merely mischievous turns out to be a political joke labelled in tiny cipher letters with a local abbot's nickname. Everyone, in every century, learns to wink. You turn to a parchment palimpsest. The top text a gloss on theology, the undertext a ghost, the scraped-off bones of an earlier book. In your world before the switch, scholars used multispectral imaging to coax such undertext to speak. Now the letters simply rise. Beneath the obedient gloss you hear a 13th century woman's hand, you recognise it by its sharp, tidy minims, copying a medical recipe collection, wound salves, birthroom herbs, a tincture for fever using willow bark scraped at dawn. Historians are still debating whether the surge of household recipe books signals women's authorship or merely women's labour as transmitters, and 1,000 fresh pages in neat domestic cipher would push that debate toward authorship, not mere copying. Another codex announces itself with ornaments, red and blue capitals like lit windows. The main text is pious enough, but inside the initials the painter has tucked letters of a second, alphabet, minuscule, recursive, spelling names, patron names, lover names, workshop jokes. The book becomes a guild ledger in disguise, preserving the network that paid for pigment and candles. Hypothesis. With the switch thrown, Europe's manuscript archives would reveal a far denser lattice of female patrons and artisans than the printed record admits, their signatures encoded decoratively to dodge rules about who could commission what. You let your eyes rest on a famously obstinate object, bound in a modern casing to keep it from falling to powder. The script walks like ants. The plants look plausible but not quite right. Water ripples full of star charts, the nude bathers resigned and busy. People have given it a proper noun and a century of theories, some scholarly, some cheerfully wild. Tonight the pages finally stop smirking. They explain themselves as a compendium in a regional vernacular, a practical book from the early 15th century with herbal notes, women's health advice, bathing customs, recipes for pigments and soaps, and a calendar built around local saints' days and the Pleiades. It is not the universe in code, it is household science and midwife memory dressed up to avoid nosy churchmen and nosier husbands. Relief, a little disappointment, and then delight. Useful books often pretend to be obscure to survive. Across the table waits a slimmer, humbler booklet of the sort scholars once shrugged off, the kind of thing found walled up in a priest hole or tucked under a plank. The hand is cramped but regular. The language is a vernacular salted with Latin. It records meetings of a lay devotional group that read scripture in translation despite repeated bans. Names, locations, dates, fines, who lent whose copy to whom. With one evening's new legibility, a movement that used to be a rumour becomes a map with lanterns on it. You can follow the book's itinerary from attic to attic, border to border. The costs of reading are paid in coins and in fear. You let yourself have one page of alchemy, because you are still, somewhere under the sensible sleepiness, 12 years old and certain that if you read just one more paragraph, you will turn lead into something brighter. The jar shapes and planetary symbols unfold neatly into lab notes that make your room smell of vinegar and ashes. Among the recipes for verdigris and alum mordants, you find a precise instruction for preparing a blue lake pigment that resists fading. Painters had begged alchemists for centuries for blues that did not sulk. Here is one formula sharing a bench with transmutation dreams. Hypothesis, practical and satisfying. Cryptic workshop books will restore lines of craft continuity, dyes, inks, glues, paper sizing, that conservators and artists can test tomorrow morning, and the colours on Europe's paintings will begin to look less guessed at and more like the painters intended. The door to politics creaks open next. A cipher letter in a secretary hand pinned to a file stuffed during a civil war switches from lover's nickname to troop counts with a single flourish of the quill. You watch a Queen's agent instruct a city to feign neutrality, while smuggling powder downriver in flour barrels. Another packet, sealed in wax stamped with a lion, contains an alphabet key so simple it feels insulting. A becomes D, B becomes E, yet it ran a spy network for years because everyone believed their own mystery. The modern world will want to make heroes or villains of these people. The pages prefer complexity. There are jokes about the church that monks wrote anyway, and hid in the folds of commentary like roasted chestnuts. There are instructions for masking names in guild minutes by interleaving letters with psalm numbers. There are diaries where the I becomes we for 3 lines whenever the writer touches news too hot to own. And yes, there are fantasies. A friar writes an entire bestiary in cipher so that he can be properly exuberant about sea monsters without inviting a visit from the suspicious. You pause for breath and let an anxious thought pass through you like a moth. When everything legible becomes public, will anything remain safe? Not all secrets were hoarded to hoard power. Some were folded gently to protect. A midwife wrote down techniques in a private alphabet so that another woman could learn without a man in the room pressing for explanations. A Jewish moneylender invented a columnar cipher to keep a debtor's name out of a priest's gossip. A poet wove a second poem through the first so that a beloved could read it and no one else could blush. We will need a new ethic, you think, one that lets us hear the dead without rummaging. Still, the scholarly earthquakes will not wait. A treatise long attributed to a famous scholastic turns out, in its own tiny self-defense cipher, to say, "I am the work of 2 hands, master and student." Authorship shifts, citations shuffle. A manuscript catalogued as medical miscellany unbuttons into a travelogue by a 14th century anchoress who gives recipes as lightly as she gives coastal distances. Women's geography acquires shoreline. Secretary's paper scraps, once useless, bloom into the logbooks of a courier system that moved messages from Bruges to Venice in the time it takes a candle to gnaw an inch. Predictable, relay by relay, like a heartbeat. Odd fact to cradle before sleep. Some inks were sweetened with a touch of honey to make the quill glide, and bored novices licked their fingers and learned lines by taste. A century later, on the same page, someone scrawled, in cipher, "Do not lick this." The prior has noticed. The page remembers the grin. You read one last argument stitched in marginal cipher around a magnificently dull sermon. 2 hands, probably the same 2 who copied the text, bicker about whether the preacher knows his Aristotle. One praises a turn of phrase, the other calls it stolen. Historians are still debating whether the medieval university was a paradise of free inquiry or a bureaucracy of licenses and fees. In these crisp, suddenly legible whispers, the answer is simply yes. It was both, sometimes in the same hour, and scholars were people who teased each other because they loved the text enough to fight for it. You rest your palm on the vellum to feel its quiet heat, the ghost of an animal that once moved under rain. When the switch snapped and all the alphabets yielded, Europe did not get stranger. It got closer. The monasteries did not become laboratories overnight. They always were, in their way. The city chancelleries did not start plotting because a new cipher alphabet was invented. They were born plotting and learned to tidy as they plotted. You, with your lamp and your soft voice and your habit of reading past your bedtime, are part of that long ink-stained fraternity. You close the book. The lamp gutters. Somewhere a bell changes the hour, and you carry into the next room of the night the knowledge that secrecy is not the same as darkness. Sometimes it is simply a curtain to let the candle burn without wind. The rain has been falling for days, steady and soft, soaking the ground until the rivers run thick and brown. You stand on the bank of one of those rivers, looking at the stone foundation of something so old that even the local legends have trouble agreeing on its name. The water has eaten away at the soil, revealing pieces of carved rock, half buried in mud, lines of symbols smoothed by centuries, yet still visible. They do not match any known script of the last few thousand years. These are the writings of a civilization so old its existence is often treated as a story, a myth folded into other myths. You've heard their echo in flood legends, in tales of great cities swallowed by water, in fragments of ancient poems about gods who walked among humans before the dawn of memory. In the midnight switch world, the moment your eyes rest on these strange lines, they bloom into words you can understand. The authoritative fact, archaeology has uncovered tantalizing evidence of organized human society predating Sumer, Egypt, and the Indus Valley. Sites like Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey, dated to around 9600 BCE, show monumental architecture built before agriculture was fully established. And yet, no complete written records from such deep prehistory have ever been found. Or, if they have, they are so alien in form that we have failed to recognize them as writing. You kneel in the mud, tracing the symbols on a stone slab. In the midnight switch moment, it becomes a record of a gathering, a treaty between several riverine settlements, agreeing to share water rights and fishing grounds sealed by a ritual feast. The language is unlike any modern tongue, but its ideas are as familiar as yesterday's news. The odd fact: in the 19th century, a farmer in Bosnia unearthed a block of stone covered in unknown markings. It was dismissed as a curiosity, probably decorative, and eventually disappeared into a private collection. Some researchers have suggested it might have been an example of a forgotten script. If it reappeared in the instant decoding world, we might find it was a fragment of law or a hymn written by a culture no one today remembers by name. Hypothesis: if the languages of these pre-flood or pre-Bronze Age societies could be read, we might discover that they had contact across vast distances. Historians are still debating whether early humans were capable of transoceanic travel before recorded history. A single, well-dated inscription mentioning a far-off coast or unfamiliar constellation could tilt the debate toward voyages far earlier than anyone now admits. You imagine walking among their cities, not the stone palaces of later empires, but networks of timber halls, earthen ramparts, and sacred enclosures aligned to the stars. Every wall and post marked with symbols, tallies of stored grain, records of marriages, instructions for seasonal rituals. People often think of civilization as beginning with writing, but here, writing was already woven into their lives even before the first plough scratched a furrow in the earth. In the midnight switch reality, you could read the walls of their meeting halls. On the day the moon hides its face, the chiefs of the four rivers shall meet and renew their oaths. You could understand the graffiti left on the stones of a communal hearth. The fish were plentiful this summer, remember this spot. You could follow their migrations by the trail of symbols carved into boulders along riverbanks, noting the movement of herds, the rise and fall of floods. But not every discovery would be gentle. Imagine finding a text that describes a violent split between factions, the destruction of rival villages, or the enslavement of defeated peoples, events long forgotten, yet recorded in plain, unblinking language. Myths that seem to tell of gods punishing humans might turn out to be historical accounts of human cruelty and ambition. Modern culture would not be immune to the shock. People today who see themselves as living at the pinnacle of human development might have to accept that others, 10,000 years ago, organized complex societies, practiced diplomacy, and recorded history long before the first civilizations in textbooks. You stay by the river as the rain slackens, watching the water slide past the carved stones. For the first time, those stones feel less like ancient ruins and more like pages torn from a book you've just begun to read. The voices in those pages are calm and confident, speaking across a gulf of time so wide it should feel alien, yet somehow it feels like listening to neighbors a few villages away. And in that moment, you realize the midnight switch has not just given you the ability to read forgotten words, it has made the distant past feel close enough to touch. Night leans against a colonnade, and the sea answers with a patient hush. Lamps bead the harbour road, and somewhere beyond the warehouses the lighthouse of Pharos throws its slow, revolving attention over black water. You walk inland through a web of streets that smell of cinnamon, fish scales, and damp reeds. Alexandria is not quiet, even after midnight. It crackles with argument. In courtyards, on stairwells, under porches, people are telling each other what the world is made of and how to prove it with a diagram and a wager. In the midnight switch world, you push through a cedar door into a long room where papyrus sleeps in pigeonholes like beehives. The words wake as soon as you look at them. Here is the thing you have wanted since childhood. Shelves upon shelves of the library and its sister, the Mausion, alive again. Not an empty legend, but spines, labels, scribal notes, the dizziness of too much to know. The authoritative fact you hold first, lightly, because it is a crowded fact, is that in the 3rd century BCE, the poet-scholar Callimachus compiled the Pinnaces, a multi-volume catalogue of authors and works, arranged by subject with biographical notes and first lines to disambiguate copies. It is the ancestor of every card catalogue that ever taught a hand to flick. The Pinnaces existed. We know their titles and fragments. In this night's sudden legibility you read them whole, and the sheer audacity of filing the world takes your breath. You turn to a cubby labelled with a careful hand. On the fixed stars, Aristarchus. The sheets glide free and tell you something you half expected and still can't quite believe, that this Alexandrian, 2 centuries before Christ, argued for a sun-centered cosmos with the earth moving around it. We knew the rumour, now the proof stand in his own clipped prose, diagrams clear and modest. A marginal note from a later reader, Aristarchus' contemporary the librarian Aristarchus of Samothrace, another Aristarchus, frets politely about parallax. Historians are still debating whether such heliocentric whispers were debated in the great halls or tucked away in private circles, but the scratchy, irritated quill in the margin sounds like a voice raised at dinner. Odd fact, bright and a little rude. The Ptolemaic customs officers at this port famously searched incoming ships for books. Original copies were taken to the library's copyists. The ships received careful duplicates tagged from the ships, while the originals were shelved in Alexandria with serene confidence. In the instant decoding night you hold one such duplicate, stamped in a red ochre clerk's hand with an apologetic flourish, Apton Neon, and you cannot help laughing softly. Even piracy wears a tidy label. A roll crackles in your fingers and you smell the faint sweetness of gum arabic. It is Euclid, but not the elements you memorized with the resigned patience of a schoolchild. This is a lost manual on geometric constructions used by artisans of wood and stone, full of short proofs that smell of sawdust and plaster. A later page offers practical ratios for builders' arches on soft ground. Hypothesis: the library's shelves were not merely for philosophers and kings. They held manuals for roofers, shipwrights, pigment grinders, and midwives, genres of knowledge we later filed under craft and so mislaid. The switch pulls them forward, and the wall between high and useful thins until you could step over it without noticing. 3 rooms away, behind a screen painted with ibis and lotuses, whispering scholars used to argue about accents on Homer. You slide a drawer and find Aristarchus of Samothrace's marked copy, the accent marks neat as pins, the scholia poised like insects in amber. He quarrels with Zenodotus and favourably cites Aristophanes of Byzantium with a backhanded compliment that lands like a wink. These are the debate rooms of Alexandria, not marble stages but paper arenas, where every marginal arrow is a jab and every variant reading an offered glove. A letter catches you because it is not meant to be kept. Archimedes writes from Syracuse to Eratosthenes, who runs the library like a man tuning a lyre. He proposes a proof about spheres and cylinders, then veers into mischief. Could Eratosthenes please not solve it too quickly at dinner? The famous measuring of Earth's circumference appears in a dry corner of a different roll, a survey of wells, shadows, and the geometry of noon. The tone is so practical it squeaks. You realise that in this city lunch could turn into a planetary measurement if someone remembered the right stick. Outside, a gull screams like a hinge. Inside, the catalogue takes your hand again. Tragedies. Here are the plays of Aeschylus and Sophocles that smoke and rumour claimed existed but no one had touched in 2,000 years. Comedy. Menander not in shreds but whole, so humane and sharp that you feel suddenly less alone in the late hour. History. A Carthaginian chronicle that names pilot stations on the Atlantic coast and notes a star the Greeks never mentioned. Philosophy. Lost dialogues of Aristotle that sound like a teacher walking with students around a garden, kicking up dust, letting the quiet ones take the long way to a point. A question balances on your tongue. How did it end? People prefer grand fires to long neglect. You open a case labelled Records of Damage, expecting ash. Instead you find bureaucracy. Receipts for barrels of water moved during Julius Caesar's siege in 48 BCE. Complaints about looted papyrus stores during Aurelian's campaign in the 3rd century. A sorrowing inventory from the late 4th century when zealots, backed by a bishop's order, dismantled the Serapeum, the daughter library's colonnades clattering into the dust of their own furniture. Then a centuries later anecdote claiming the Arab conquerors burned the remainder for bath fuel, which unrolls, here, into silence. It is late embroidery, not cloth. Historians are still debating whether the library died once in flame or many times in mildew, rats, politics, and indifference. The ledgers suggest the slow death that real institutions die, underfunded, trimmed, repurposed, loved too little. You pause on a page of rules written in a tidy Greek hand. Residents of the Mausion receive meals at public expense, shelter, and exemption from taxes, provided they give lectures and maintain their fields. This city paid stipends for curiosity. That was the policy. And then, because Alexandria cannot help itself, the next page is a list of fines for noisy arguments after the 5th hour. You smile. Even generosity needs a librarian to shush it. There are lives in the shelves, a tract in Egyptian demotic composed by a physician who records a test for contaminant metals in wine, a Syriac translation of a lost Greek romance where lovers wrangle over a shipwreck and a jar of olives becomes a plot device, a Hebrew astronomical table cross-walking Babylonian months to Greek, with a note about a comet like a broom seen over the delta, a short, fierce Coptic sermon scolding a governor for cheating widows. Every doorway in this building opens onto other languages, and your midnight switch has thrown every latch. Odd but off-topic and therefore perfect for a weary hour. A clerk's notebook listing animals kept in the royal menagerie, Egyptian mongoose, Nubian giraffe, a crate labelled singing birds, small and argumentative. Another page holds recipes for inks, lampblack mixed with wine lees, copper salts for green, sepia from cuttlefish. Someone has drawn a hand with a blister where a quill rubs. Every grand institution has to decide what to do about blisters. Alexandria wrote them down. You run a fingertip along a ragged edge and it trembles barely there. Not everything returns with a flourish. Some works survive only as quotations in other works. A line from Sappho sewn into a commentary, a sentence from Heraclitus tucked into a speech. The switch does not conjure papyrus from dust, but it releases meaning from the scraps that remain. A papyrus accounting sheet is written on the back of a lost philosopher's page. Turn it, and the philosopher's last paragraph, on friendship as a shared roof, arrives like a rescued breath. Here is where the creepiness walks in on soft feet. A scroll catalogued as miscellany opens into dream reports collected by a temple of Serapis. People saw their dead fathers walking through market stalls, asked questions about missing jewellery, received advice on where to find a decent midwife. The priest annotates in pencil-thin Greek. The dream about the fish is probably about money. He is half counsellor, half bureaucrat of the subconscious. Another roll files curses purchased by angry merchants, binding spells stitched in letters so spidery they look like cobwebs. Your voice drops to a whisper without deciding to. The past is not just argument. It is also the private wish said quietly into a god's busy ear. Hypothesis to float on the library air. If you could read every Alexandrian catalogue, every epitome, every marginal note, you might reconstruct entire books now lost, by triangulation, what later authors quoted, what the Pinnacs summarized, what scribes flagged as similar. The shadow library of what once was would thicken until it functioned like the thing itself. And if the instant legibility spread outward, as it does tonight, to every book list in Pergamon, every scribal note in Oxyrhynchus, every teacher's reading calendar in Antioch, you could map the ancient information economy the way one maps currents by watching birds. You think about modern quarrels and imagine tomorrow morning's headlines. Someone will claim the library for a nation-state that did not yet exist. Someone else will insist the true spirit of the Mouseion was cosmopolitan, and no banner may drape it without lying. Grants will be written. Conference flights will be booked. A philanthropist will fund the new Pinnacs with the kind of earnestness that breaks your heart a little and also pays for electricity. The dead you suspect will tolerate us. They like to fuss. On your way out you pass a room where instruments are kept. Gnomons, armillary spheres, a bronze device like a nested jaw, gears for predicting where planets will wander. The grease on one axle still smells faintly of animal fat. You look back and wonder if the person who oiled it sang under his breath. Softly, because the room was full of people who preferred their night sky sober and labelled. At the threshold you stop. A small shelf near the door holds books for loan, the humble end of the grand machine. On top is a scribe's manual instructing beginners to wet the reed with the tongue, to keep the wrist loose, to rest every 300 lines and praise the god who invented lamps. In the margin someone has written, "My neck hurts," in a tiny precise hand, and someone else has replied, "Mine more." The city of scholars is, at last, a city of bodies. You step back into the alley. The lighthouse still turns, and the grey suggestion of dawn feels very far away. You realise you have been holding your breath. You also realise that for all the thunder people attach to the word Alexandria, what moved you most was not the heroics, the heliocentric diagrams, the lost tragedies tumbling back into the world, but a dull little list of fines for after-hours bickering, ink recipes, and a complaint about a sore neck. The library's greatness was exactly this. It kept the grand and the petty in the same building, and taught them not to be ashamed of each other. You walk toward the sea and carry with you a new sound, not the echo of a legend, but the low, ongoing murmur of a working place. Pages breathe, catalogues clear their throats. The debate rooms of Alexandria never closed. We simply forgot how to hear them. Tonight, with the switch thrown and your pulse steadying, you do. The parchment is stiff from salt, the ink faded to the colour of storm clouds. You're on the deck of a ship that's been lifted from the bottom of the sea after centuries of sleep. Its timbers creak as if remembering the swell. The divers found the chart sealed in a copper tube beneath the captain's quarters, and when they unrolled it, they saw lines that no modern map includes, coastlines oddly stretched, islands that should not be there, and names in a script no one could read. In our world, it would be catalogued as mysterious, undeciphered, possible forgery. In the midnight switch world, it reads itself into your mind like a tide pulling in. The authoritative fact: ancient maps were often accompanied by written itineraries, periploi, describing ports, landmarks, and sailing times. Many are lost, others survive in fragments, copied centuries later. The Piri race map of 1513, which famously includes parts of South America, was compiled from earlier sources, some possibly ancient. Even more tantalizing are the references in Greco-Roman and Chinese records to maps of lands beyond their known worlds. Without legible annotations, these remain speculation. You kneel over the recovered chart, tracing the elegant strokes. One note, written beside a long stretch of unfamiliar coastline, says, "Here the sea turns warm even in winter, and the stars shift low on the horizon." Another marks a river mouth where birds with scarlet necks gather in flocks. The scale is unlike anything in your textbooks, drawn from a sailor's sense of distance, measured in days and prevailing winds, not in degrees of latitude. Odd fact, in 1901, a cache of navigational tablets was reportedly found in Micronesia, slabs of coral inlaid with shell patterns. The symbols were said to represent island chains and currents, but no one could agree on their reading, and most were dispersed to private collections. In the midnight switch moment, you could read each one as if its maker were standing at your shoulder. From this atoll to the next, follow the swell of the north wind. When the cloud pillar rests on the horizon, change your heading to follow the shark constellation. Hypothesis: if every ancient map's annotations could be read, we might discover pre-modern contact between regions now thought to have been isolated for millennia. Historians are still debating whether such connections existed, whether Phoenicians rounded Africa or Polynesians reached the Americas before Europeans. A single translated log could change legend into record. You imagine walking into a temple storeroom in Egypt, where a scroll long thought to be a ceremonial text turns out, in the midnight switch world, to be a sailor's report of a voyage far south beyond the monsoon winds, or unwrapping a bamboo scroll in a Chinese tomb and reading instructions for steering by a star unknown to northern navigators, a star only visible far across the equator. Some records are not maps at all, but cargo manifests that double as geography. A merchant in the Red Sea lists silver from the Sunset Lands, alongside cinnamon, ivory and lapis lazuli. A note in the margin warns that the silver ships only appear when the east wind has tasted snow. Others are political. A treaty between two distant ports to respect each other's fishing waters, implying regular contact that historians would call impossible, until now. The unsettling part is that some of these mapped lands are gone. A chart from the Aegean shows a low, wide island where only open sea lies today. The annotation describes fresh water, grazing animals, and a harbour sheltered by twin headlands. In the instant decoding world, it's hard not to think of vanished lands swallowed by earthquakes, volcanoes, or rising seas. Some might be the source of legends: Atlantis, Hiva, Antilia, now with coordinates precise enough to tempt an expedition. Modern governments would not be calm about these revelations. Maritime boundaries, exclusive economic zones, and even the first discovery claims enshrined in treaties could be contested. A map proving ancient sovereignty over certain waters might be worth more than gold, or cause more trouble than any treasure chest. You step back from the table in the ship's conservation lab. Around you are other artifacts awaiting their own voices: a scrap of sailcloth marked with symbols showing the route to a sacred island, a wooden tally of harbours with their prevailing wind directions, a set of lead tags, each naming a port in a chain across the Indian Ocean. In the midnight switch night, the sea lanes of the past glow like threads in a woven mat, crisscrossing continents in patterns no modern atlas shows. You see not a world of separate ancient cultures, but one stitched together by wind, current, and daring, its memory recorded in scripts that have finally, quietly, decided to tell you the way. The room is dim, the shutters drawn. You're sitting at a long table in a quiet government archive, the kind of place where you have to sign your name twice before they even let you see the catalogue. The archivist brings you a small wooden box. Inside are fragments of clay, bone, and parchment, each sealed in a slip of plastic, each tagged with an accession number but no description. In the ordinary world, these are just pieces of undeciphered scripts, oddities in the collection too obscure to warrant priority. In the midnight switch world, they begin to speak before you even touch them, and what they say is problematic. The authoritative fact: history is often curated by omission. Inscriptions are ignored, documents misplaced, or entire finds locked away in restricted collections if they threaten political, religious, or economic narratives. We have examples, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were kept from wide scholarly access for decades, or certain colonial-era archives sealed to avoid diplomatic fallout. The difference now is that with every ancient language decoded instantly, there is no way to choose which parts of the past become visible. Everything is visible. You pick up a tablet from a site in Anatolia, long thought to be a ceremonial dedication. In the instant decoding world, the inscription reads, "In the treaty year, the ruler of the Western land came in secret, bringing gifts and pledging loyalty to the High King. The Western land is one modern nation's most cherished ancient ancestor." The text rewrites that origin story as submission, not sovereignty. Odd fact: in the 19th century, a British museum curator quietly buried a collection of inscribed ivory plaques from a Middle Eastern dig in the basement after translating a few lines that suggested trade and possibly technology exchange between a biblical kingdom and an enemy power. Those plaques, still languishing in storage, are now crystal clear in meaning. They describe the exchange of metalworking techniques in return for military aid. Hypothesis: the midnight switch would uncover records of events deliberately erased from history: massacres, forced migrations, secret alliances, betrayals. Historians are still debating whether certain ancient empires collapsed purely from environmental causes or whether elite treachery played a role. A single translated letter from a royal archive could confirm a conspiracy long suspected but never proven. You work through more items. A Roman bronze plaque from an outpost on the Rhine describes sending gold to bribe a Germanic tribe not to attack, contradicting centuries of imperial propaganda about military supremacy. A Mayan stela records the execution of an allied ruler for suspected disloyalty, an episode absent from both oral tradition and previous interpretations of glyphs. A scratched potsherd from North Africa lists the names of households relocated inland to make way for a foreign garrison, with a note that the local priest protested in writing no one could read until now. The air in the archive feels heavier. You realise these aren't just dusty truths, they are live wires. Entire fields of archaeology and history would shift in hours, but so would the stories nations tell themselves. The past can be inspirational, but it can also be used as a weapon. A translation proving an ancient claim to territory might ignite diplomatic crises. Another showing that a revered national founder was an opportunistic warlord could undermine political unity. Some discoveries would be personally explosive. Imagine an inscription proving that a religious text borrowed heavily from an older pagan source, or a funerary tablet revealing that a dynastic ancestor was not the heroic liberator portrayed in genealogies, but a usurper. In our world, such claims can be dismissed as fringe theories. In the midnight switch world, the source material is there in the original hand. You step away from the table. In your mind's eye, you see museum directors receiving frantic calls from ministries. You hear the click of locks on storerooms that only yesterday were open to visiting researchers. But the genie is out of the bottle. Every photograph, every rubbing, every fragment ever catalogued is already in someone's hands, and the translations are spreading. The unsettling part is that you can't unread them. That clay tablet from Anatolia, you'll remember its words long after you leave. That bronze plaque from the Rhine, its confession will be with you every time you hear about Rome's unbroken frontier. Outside, the street is bright with ordinary life. Buses rumbling past, people queuing for coffee. None of them know yet that the ground beneath their histories has shifted. But you know. And in the midnight switch world, the past isn't just speaking, It's whispering things into your ear that someone somewhere wishes you'd never heard. Morning in the midnight switch world is strange. The sun rises over the same streets, the same rooftops, the same birdsong, but there is a hum beneath it all, a constant low vibration made not of sound, but of meaning. Every ancient inscription, every fragment, every scrap of scratched bone or faded papyrus has spoken overnight. The world wakes with a new kind of memory, and it is too much for one mind to hold. You watch the first hours unfold. In the newsrooms, editors hunch over screens, trying to decide which revelations to lead with. In universities, professors are cancelling lectures, not because they have nothing to teach, but because their syllabi are now out of date by several thousand years. Museums open early, their halls filled with people standing silently before cases that have not changed in decades, but whose contents are suddenly alive. The authoritative fact: in our world, the pace of historical discovery is slow by necessity. New translations take years, debates take decades to resolve, and consensus takes generations. Here, consensus has no time to form before the next truth arrives. The entire backlog of human silence has been dumped into the present, all at once. Odd fact: a single word can undo a century of scholarship. In 1907, an inscription found in Crete was assumed to be a religious dedication. Decades later, re-examination showed it was a contract for a shipment of goats. Harmless enough, but in the midnight switch world, this sort of quiet reversal happens millions of times before breakfast. The hypothesis: humanity has always built its sense of self on the stories it tells about the past. Historians are still debating whether our social cohesion depends more on truth or on agreed-upon myth. Now, those myths are meeting the truths head-on, and there is no time to prepare for the collision. Some changes are subtle. A schoolchild learns that the first poem in her language is 2 centuries older than she was told, written by someone whose name had been forgotten. A coastal village finds proof that its ancestors navigated to distant islands long before outsiders arrived. An indigenous community gains an unbroken written record that connects them directly to a people scholars had dismissed as vanished. Other changes are seismic. Treaties are challenged on the basis of ancient borders newly legible. Religious leaders convene emergency councils to discuss revelations about their traditions' origins. Political parties seize on fragments that support their narratives, ignoring the ones that complicate them. You walk through a park and see a man sitting on a bench holding a phone, weeping. On the screen is a translation of a funerary inscription from 2,000 years ago, a letter from a father to his dead daughter, telling her how much he misses her laugh. It's not famous, it's not world-changing, but it has reached across centuries to speak directly to him, and that is what you notice as the day moves on. The Great Decoding is not just about grand histories and political consequences, it is also about the small private connections. A recipe from an unnamed cook in ancient Persia becomes the centerpiece of a family dinner. A joke from a Roman tavern wall makes someone in Tokyo laugh out loud. A lullaby carved into a piece of driftwood from a Pacific island is sung again to a baby in a modern apartment. By nightfall, the hum of meaning has settled into the background. People are still arguing, still sorting, still deciding what to do with the flood of truth. Some have already turned away, retreating into the comfort of familiar stories. Others are diving deeper, looking for every scrap of connection they can find. The world has not ended, it has simply widened, and you, walking home under the streetlights, realize that you have been changed in a quieter way. You will never again look at a museum label, a ruin, or a weathered stone without wondering what else it might be saying, if only you could hear it. In the midnight switch world, you can. And even if the switch were flipped back tomorrow, the memory of those voices would remain, like an afterimage, impossible to forget. So now the switch is off. Or maybe it was never on at all. Maybe it was only in your head. This long night of voices, rising from clay and bone and salt-stained parchment. You lie there in the quiet, but the quiet feels different. It's no longer an absence. It's a fullness, a pause between sentences. Somewhere in that space, you can still hear the faintest echoes of the words that came to you. You think about the clay tablet from the riverbank, the scroll hidden in the ash, the knot of cord in a mountain storehouse, the carving on a temple wall deep in the jungle. You think about the people who made them, not as distant, anonymous ancients, but as hands and eyes, warm breaths and tired backs. Some of them were kings or priests, many were not. They were workers, traders, children, friends. They wrote for reasons that are still familiar: to remember, to instruct, to boast, to confess, to make someone laugh, to keep someone close. The midnight switch was never really about solving mysteries. It was about what happens when you finally hear a voice that has been waiting for you for centuries. And how, once you've heard it, you can't unknow that it was always there. Your breathing slows. The imagined shelves of the Library of Alexandria recede into the dark. The wind over the Eurasian steppe softens into the hum of your room. The ocean swells that once carried a Polynesian navigator across the horizon fold themselves into a quiet rhythm you can almost sync your heartbeat to. The past is not gone. It is here, beside you, behind you, beneath you, speaking in every fragment, every mark, every pattern. All you have to do is close your eyes and listen. Good night.